What's going on, everybody, and welcome to today's edition of SWAC Talk, the show where we cover the SWAC inside and out. I'm your host, Charles Wells, and I'm coming at you with another edition of the SWAC Talk Time Machine. We're going to hop in a trusty old DeLorean like Back to the Future and take a trip back to 2001. Um, this was a very interesting year in the SWAC. Things were starting to kind of change from obviously from the 90s into the 2000s. Grambling was beginning their run of SWAC championships in this time period. You had the Alabamas, both Bama teams making runs as well. Southern and Jackson still kind of in the mix, but not quite as dominant as they were in the 90s. So it was like a period of transition, and that would honestly lead to kind of a mid portion of the SWAC in the mid 2000s where it was not as good as it could be, and now we're kind of on the uptick from that. But this year, 2001, Alabama State won the SWAC East with a 6-1 record. They were 8-4 overall. Jackson State was 5-2 in the SWAC, 7-4 overall. Alcorn was 5-2 and 6-5 overall. And if you remember, in 2000, Alcorn was winless, so they bounced back in a major way. Alabama A&M was 3-4 and 4-7, so they had a pretty bad season coming off of their first SWAC championship appearance in 2000. And Valley was kind of Valley at 0-7 and 0-11. Grambling won the West at 6-1. They were 10-1 overall. They finished number 8 in the FC in Division I AA rankings at that point. Southern was 5-2 and 7-4 overall. Prairie View was 2-5, 3-7 overall. They were kind of starting to put things together a little bit. 7 would be the time that Prairie View would kind of go ahead and start to rise to what they would become in 2009. Texas Southern was 2-5, 3-7 overall. And this is typical Texas Southern. They're gonna always hover between 3-6 wins. Occasionally they will win 7. They may go winless from time to time, like they're on that losing streak now, but they're always gonna kind of bounce between 3-8, 3-7, 6-5, 6-4, something like that. Always up and down, just nothing really consistent. And Pine Bluff was 1-6 and 4-7 overall. So as you can see, the East had 3 teams with winning records in conference and overall. The West had 2 teams with winning records in conference and overall. Everybody else was not good at all. So this was not really a strong West Division as it would start to be in the late 2000s and 2010s. The East was kind of running the show at that point, although Grambling had the best team in the league. We're going to take a look at how Alabama State got here in this season, and they were led by a tremendous offense and probably one of the most underrated quarterbacks in SWAC history, and honestly, in Division I AA as well, and that's Darnell Kennedy. He was a 4-year starter. He started as a freshman, I think, probably like midpoint of his freshman season, and the kid could spin the ball. Man, he was a great passer. I think he finished 4th all time in passing yardage in the SWAC. He was just a guy who can really put the ball in the air. He had a great offense this year. He had BJ Tiger, who was his one of his top receivers. He had a nice running game as well. But that offense has started to take shape in the late 90s when Kennedy first got there, and by his senior year in 2001, it was clicking on all cylinders. They lost their first game of the season against Alcorn 20-17. They lost to Southern 32-7. They beat Johnson C. Smith 71-6. They beat Jackson State 61-58. That's another high scoring game. Texas Southern they defeated 27-24. They beat Pine Bluff 23-17. They shut out Alabama A&M in the Magic City Classic 35-0. They beat Grambling in the first matchup between these two teams 45-38. They beat Clark Atlanta 43-10. They beat Valley 57-24. They lost to Tuskegee, who was a team who always gave them problems. Even though Tuskegee is a Division II team, they always gave Alabama State problems in the Turkey Day Classic. They lost that game 31-27. and then they would go on to lose to Grambling in the SWAC Championship game 31-38. But Alabama State really had a really good season, and this would begin kind of like a nice little run for them in the mid 2000s. They would end up with another SWAC championship appearance in 2003 and 4. So they really started to put things together. They had a nice little quarterback tree, not really a tree, but a nice little succession of two quarterbacks, Darnell Kennedy and then Tavares Jackson, T-Jack, rest in peace. But they started to put some things together. They started to get better on defense. They started having a better running attack and still had some nice receivers to go with that. So they really put themselves in a nice position, and they were a very, very tough team to stop in 2001 because their offense was really, really good. Defensively, they did what they had to do for most times, but offensively, it was where it was at with them. Grambling came into this season. They defeated Alcorn 37-22. They beat Alabama A&M 30-7. They beat Portland State 30-29. They beat Prairie View 40-6. They beat Pine Bluff 60-7. They beat Jackson State 30-16. They beat Texas Southern 43-3. They beat Alabama. They lost to Alabama State 45-38. They beat Nicholls State 37-28. They beat Southern 30-20, which was their first win in the Bayou Classic in 8 years. So that was a big feather in the cap for Doug Williams there to get Grambling off of that huge losing streak in the Bayou Classic. And as I said before, they defeated Alabama State 38-31 in the SWAC Championship game. One thing that really jumps out at you when you look at Grambling's season, they won 2 games against non-conference Division AA FCS teams. They defeated Portland State and Nicholls State. These early 2000 Grambling teams were very, very good. I mean, obviously, that goes without saying, but they were a very physical team on defense. They didn't really have great numbers against the pass, but they really hit you. They had guys like Calvin Sears and Chris Brown as the cornerbacks, Denmark Reed and Calvin Pearson. Also, Ron Scott Taylor was a linebacker. They really got after you, but offensively, it was where it was. Randy Hines was a senior quarterback that year. Like I said in the last show, he was probably a few years ahead of his time when it comes to being a dual threat type of guy. He's what a lot of quarterbacks are today, that a guy who runs probably better than he throws, but he has a big arm and he's athletic and physical because he also was a basketball player. He had really good size. Played receiver a couple years at Grambling as well. So he was a tremendous athlete. Didn't really have the most accurate arm, but he had a big arm and he could beat you downfield if you let him. But he could hurt you. He could hurt the team if he didn't really get in the rhythm. Brad Hill and Kendrick Shanklin were 2 running backs that they had. They had a really good offensive line. Levi Washington and Ellis Spears led the receiving corps. Also had a young Tremont Douglas, who will become one of their better receivers in the near future. And this game really was a very, very good game. It was an entertaining game to watch. It had a lot of big players on both sides. Alabama State actually started the scoring off with a 63-yard touchdown pass with like 23 seconds to go in the game. Darnell Kennedy hit BJ Tiger with a long pass to bust the game open. Grambling really struggled in the first half. They really couldn't get much rhythm. They decided to try to run the ball more often in the first half than they typically did, and they really couldn't get anything going. Randy Hines had a really bad first half. He threw an interception and just didn't really look sharp. Alabama State would go on to score another touchdown in the second quarter, and Grambling got a late touchdown in the second quarter to go into the half down 17-9. They missed the extra point. Alabama State came out after Grambling fumbled the ball to start early in the third quarter, and they scored a touchdown to go up 24-9. So they were cruising and looking like a championship was really en route. When you have an offense like they have and a defense who was making plays, you looking like, I don't see how we're gonna lose this game. But Alabama State started to turn the ball over. Darnell Kennedy fumbled the ball. Grambling got the ball. They scored and got the 2-point conversion. So now they're down 24-16. And they would go on to catch up with Alabama State. And before you knew it, the score was tied at 31. Alabama State fumbled the ball again. Grambling was able to score a couple of times and swing the momentum. The third quarter was really Grambling's quarter after the beginning of the quarter. And then they closed it out with a late touchdown to take a 38-31 lead and to get themselves a victory. Alabama State really let that game slip. Penalties and turnovers. Alabama State had 18 plus penalties in that game. Grambling was penalized a lot. Those two teams were probably the two most penalized teams in the conference that year, and the refereeing wasn't all that great. If you know anything about SWAC football, you know referees historically have been very, very trash, and they made some iffy calls in this game. They had a couple of turnovers that probably shouldn't have been turnovers. You know, sometimes they were quick with their whistles, sometimes they were late with their whistles, and you know that's kind of how refereeing goes in the SWAC. You know, from time to time, it's getting a lot better, but at that point in time, refereeing was like a crapshoot. But this was a game that really could have been anybody's game. Alabama State had the game in control for the most part. They let it get away from them. Grambling showed the mark of a champion, and they never gave up. They just did not look sharp in the first half, but they started getting some opportunities. And Randy Hines started to get hot. He hit a couple big plays. Receivers made some tremendous catches in the second half. The running game was enough to get them where they needed to go. And they won the game 38-31, which would be the second SWAC championship in a row. And then they were, spoiler alert, they were going to win the 2002 championship game as well. So Grambling actually had a run of 3 championships in a row. And they were a very, very good team at that point. They were rarely losing games at that point. So they really played a really good brand of football on both sides of the ball. And they were probably one of the top teams in the SWAC historically. That era of Grambling football was really a top team in the SWAC all time because they did a lot of things, and they were fairly successful out of conference as well. So that's kind of what you're looking for when you look at how SWAC teams are, and what you're looking at right now is how they're going to perform outside of the league. So that's going to do it for this show. We jumped in. I'm going to go ahead and do my little spiel now. Didn't do it at the beginning. Socials are in the description down below. Facebook.com/SWACTalk, Twitter.com/SWACTalk76, Instagram.com/SWACTalk, and SWACTalk76@gmail.com is the email address. The show SWAC Talk is a podcast as well. Started as a podcast, moved to YouTube. It can be found on anchor.fm/SWACTalk. It can also be found on any of your digital streaming platforms: Spotify, Stitcher, Breaker, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts. You just search SWAC Talk, SWACTalk, one word. We're up to 135 subscribers now. So if you have not subscribed yet, won't you go ahead and do so? Hit that subscription and subscribe to the channel, like the video, share them, and hit the notification bell to be alerted to any content that I upload. We will be back on Sunday with our Alabama State 2021 spring season recap. That will be a podcast as well on Sunday, a YouTube video also. So you have a more in-depth look into that season on the podcast, and a kind of short and sweet look at the season on YouTube. So hope everybody's enjoying their Wednesday. Charles Wells, aka C Wells, and we're out of here.